All right. Well, thank you, Mokyr, for that welcome. Thank you to Visus for inviting me to prepare and give this talk. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'm very, very pleased to see so many familiar faces. When we teach, we sometimes think, do the students like me or not? And when they show up, when they don't have to, it's always a warm feeling. So thanks for being here. So what I want to do today is to give you a brief overview of the nature and of the Nobel Prize in economics. What is it? And then talk about why it was awarded this year, what it was awarded for. And I'm going to get into more detail on the economic history side of things, because that's what I know a lot about, not so much about the macroeconomic side of things, but we'll cover both. Okay. So I'd like to run this as I do all my lectures, which means I drone on forever and you cannot get a word in sideways. No, I'm joking. It's like, please interrupt and ask questions at any time. And at the end, if you have not spoken up, we will have some time for Q&A. Okay, so here we go. So just to begin, my Nobel medal is a bit different from the Nobel medal that was on the other slide, and the one that gets printed in every publication, newspaper, magazine, website, and so on. And that's because the Nobel medal for economics is different from all the others. In fact, it has this thing in the center. That's the monogram of the Bank of Sweden. And that is because the Nobel Prize in economics is not one of the original Nobel Prizes. Okay, so the Nobel Prizes are established in the will of Alfred Nobel, who was Swedish and made his fortune from the royalties of selling his sort of blockbuster invention, dynamite. Right? And in his will, he stipulated he wanted to create these prizes to recognize people who had done something impactful for the betterment of humanity. And he named 4 disciplines: physiology and medicine, chemistry, physics, and literature. Okay? And then a 5th one was added, peace. Okay? The first 4 are awarded by Swedish institutions. The Nobel Peace Prize is awarded by the Norwegian Parliament. And those were the Nobel Prizes between the death of Alfred Nobel around the turn of the 20th century and 1968, when the governor of the Bank of Sweden at the time, to commemorate the 300th anniversary, ostensibly, of the Bank of Sweden, negotiated with the Nobel Foundation to create a 6th award. Okay. There are several stories that are told about why this happened. Part of it was that central bank independence was not a very established concept at the time, and there was a power struggle between the central bank and the government of the time, and the bank was looking for ways to raise its image and create independence, and the governor thought that tying himself to the Nobel Foundation would provide that. And so that's one of the stories. In any case, the negotiations are fruitful, and the Bank of Sweden endows the prize with the same amount of money as the original Nobel Prizes, awarded according to the same criteria as the original Nobel Prizes by an independent body, the Royal Swedish Academy. Okay? And so it becomes the 6th so-called Nobel Prize, although the official name is not the Nobel Prize in economics, it is the Sveriges Riksbank, the Bank of Sweden's prize in economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. So if you say, this year's Nobel in economics was awarded to, someone will interrupt and say, it's not the Nobel in economics, it is the Sveriges Riksbank. Okay, you know what it is now. And within this room, we can call it the Nobel Prize in economics. So it's awarded by the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences. It's given to at most 3 people per year, and it can be given to 1 person. It can be given to 2. If that's the case, it's usually split in half, either for 1 contribution or for 2 contributions. And if it's given to 3 people, it can be split 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, or it can be split 1/2 to 1 person and 1/2 to the other 2. Okay, and that's what happened this year. One half went to one person, the other half went to the other two. It is awarded for a contribution, not for a trajectory. You will not see in the citations, oh, they have written so many papers, so many books, and so on. No, the Nobel Prize is awarded for one thing. Okay? And so there are people, we'll see one today, that have received the Nobel Prize and have gigantic trajectories behind them. And there are people that go like, I didn't know that person was still alive. We haven't heard from them in the last 30 years, but 30 years ago they wrote one paper that was very influential, and they can get the Nobel Prize for that. Okay? It is considered the highest professional honor in economics. Okay? And I think this is what really has earned the Nobel Prize in economics standing equal to the other Nobel Prizes. That despite all the room for politics, all the possibilities for tinkering and whatnot, it has consistently been awarded to people that the rest of the profession recognizes as really having made sort of dramatic contributions, right? It's very hard to go back and say, oh, look at that person got the Nobel Prize, didn't deserve it, but had the right politics or showed up at the right demonstrations or something. It's very hard, right? So all the economists that have won it are usually people that you would say, yeah, I understand why. One small deficit is that only 3 women have been recognized with the Nobel Prize in economics, or 3 of them in the last 10 or 12 years. Okay? So the face of economics is changing. We see more and more women all the time, and hopefully, once the requisite 20 or 30 years pass between their contributions and when the Nobel Committee starts looking at them, that will be reflected there as well. And usually you do see that there is this big lag between the time when a contribution is made and when the Nobel Committee recognizes it, because they want to make sure that the impact is there, that it's not a flash in the pan, right? And then it goes away. The youngest Nobel laureate has been a woman. Esther Duflo got it at 46 years of age. Right? People as old as 90 have gotten it. So this year's Nobel Prize went to 3 people. One half of the prize went to Joel Mokyr of Northwestern University, as Oki has mentioned, my doctoral dissertation advisor. And the other half of the prize went to Philippe Aghion at Harvard for most of his career, although he's now at Collège de France. And Peter Howitt, who is retired from Brown University, but is Canadian-born and actually spent most of his career and made his Nobel Prize contributions while a professor at the University of Western Ontario. Okay. And the citation of the Nobel Committee is for having explained innovation-driven economic growth. Okay. So this sort of trio are bit strange bedfellows, and we shall see why, right? 2 of them are theoretical macroeconomists. Mokyr is an economic historian of the Industrial Revolution. And you go like, how did they manage to put the 3 of them together under one banner? Well, in part that's why that banner is so wide, right? For having explained innovation-driven growth. So we'll see what that means. Before that, I should say that the illustrations of the Nobel Committee are always terrible. Okay? These 3 people look nothing like those sketches, and so this is what they actually look like. Okay? Joel Mokyr is on the left, Philippe Aghion is in the middle, and Peter Howitt is on the right. And they had all brand new pictures taken in the last sort of 3-4 weeks. Now they're easy to find everywhere. And so let's start trying to disentangle why this is a prize about innovation-driven growth. Okay? So I like to think about economic growth as the ultimate free lunch. Right? In economics, we begin by saying there is no such thing as a free lunch. Everything has a cost. Right? There are no $100 bills lying on the street, because if there were, someone would have picked them up already. Right? But yet what economic growth does is take the same amount of inputs as before and give us more output. Let us consume more, let us improve our living standards. Right? So this is almost a miracle when you think about it. We get, because the great problem of economics is that we live in a world defined by scarcity. Okay? The excess of wants and needs over the amount of available resources. And so economics is the science that tells us how do we allocate those scarce resources. But growth comes to us and says, well, wait a minute. I have a way of satisfying more of your wants and needs with the same resources. Okay? That is the key thing. Now, growth is a new thing, historically speaking, right? The history of humans on the planet goes possibly back 400,000 years or so. And we've only had true, meaningful economic growth in the last 200 years or so. So it's just the blink of an eye. Okay? In fact, as late as 1800, Thomas Malthus writes his famous treatise on population, where he paints an incredibly bleak picture of the fate of humanity. He says, the problem is, yes, we invent new things and we increase output, but whenever output increases a little, that means there's just more resources for people to eat and live longer. And what people do when they eat and live longer is they have more kids. And that increases the population, and that reduces the income per capita. And so we are always stuck in this low income per capita situation. This goes on until there's just barely enough for everyone to survive. And in fact, people tend to even reproduce beyond that, and we get what he didn't call Malthusian crisis, that's the name that came later. He called them crises of subsistence, by which he meant famine or wars or pestilences that killed a lot of people, reduced the capitas and increased income per capita again. This Malthus work is the reason why Thomas Carlyle called economics the dismal science. It's a terrible thing to think about. But that was the world in which Malthus lived. What he failed to grasp is that it was changing under his very nose, right? Because right when Malthus was working, we were having the sort of key ramp up of the Industrial Revolution, which was the first event that started economic growth. So economic growth, in the modern sense, starts, call it somewhere between 1780, 1800, 1820, around there. By 1900, it's pretty clear that we are seeing something that has not happened before in history, that all of a sudden, income per capita is growing in many countries, and a lot of people are being lifted above subsistence levels, and economic philosophers, economic thinkers, political economists, there's still no such thing as what we would call today an economist, start trying to figure out what this is. Okay? And so the early research on economic growth focuses on describing what economic growth is. Okay, and how it works. And so if you take Econ 318 and 319, the history of economic thought courses taught by Margaret Chabas in the philosophy department, you will learn about people like Wicksell or Ramsey or Harrod and Domar, who give us the first models of economic growth. And they are all focused on saying, this is how it works, this is how it happens, right? Capital expands, labor expands, we get more output, and so on. The first model that actually tackles the why, the reasons behind economic growth, the underlying forces, is due to Solow 1957. If you have taken Econ 102 and Econ 302, you've seen this model everywhere. If you are still in Econ 101, don't worry, it's coming your way next semester. Okay? And Solow identified the key factor behind economic growth in the rate of technical change, technical progress. So that is going to be our entry point today to try to tease out what the Nobel Prize contributions are about. Okay? So very quickly, output is normally modeled as a function of the factors of production. Okay? And those factors are capital, labor, and if you are an economic historian like me, you like to throw in land as well. Okay? So if you increase the amount of capital, the amount of output will go up. If you increase the amount of labor, the amount of output will go up. If you happen to increase the amount of land, not relevant today anymore, but definitely relevant in frontier economies, for example, your output will go up. Right? So that's kind of mechanical. right? I'm just saying I increase the arguments of the functions on the right-hand side, the left-hand side goes up, okay? But we can also have output increase because of technical change. That is, we do not modify the amount of capital, labor, and land, but we change the shape of the production function. We shift it upwards, and that gives us more output, okay? So this is what growth via factor accumulation works. We have capital on the horizontal axis, income on the vertical axis, and as capital grows, income grows. But because these functions exhibit diminishing returns, income grows proportionally less and less as capital grows. If we bring technical, that means that we cannot grow forever by augmenting capital. At some point, we'll hit the flat part of that curve, and no matter how much capital we throw at the production function, it will not give us increased growth, right? If we bring in technical change, what we are doing is with each innovation, we are shifting that production function upwards, okay? And so with the same amount of capital, we are getting more and more and more income. And the beauty of this type of growth is that there is no limit to it. You can keep innovating and you can keep generating more and more income with the same amount of resources. So this is the central insight of Solow, right? If we want sustained growth, and if we want to explain the type of sustained growth that started with the Industrial Revolution and continues to these days, technical change, a change in the shape in the production function, is where we need to look at. Okay? So, but even then, Solow's model is limited because it doesn't tell us where technical change comes from. Okay? Technical change is a black box. It's like the shape of the production function. And in fact, in the empirical specifications, when we try to run a regression and figure out how much capital contributes to growth, how much labor contributes, and how much is technical change, we estimate the effect of technical change as a residual, as the portion of growth that cannot be explained by capital or labor. But that's just really saying, and Solow himself said this, technical change, the Solow residual, is the measure of our ignorance. It's what we do not know about growth. Okay? So that was the departure point of the next literature, which is the one that finally gives us these Nobel Prizes, right? Which is the literature on so-called endogenous growth. And the question that rises is, what is the nature of technical change, right? And how does it continuously shift that production function upwards? And then you can take it a step further and say, and where do those forces come from in the first place? It's always, in science, in scientific research, it's really good to take on the mindset of a 3-year-old that always goes like, why? When I tell you, well, economic growth comes from technical change, goes like, and why does technical change cause economic growth? And where does it come from? You go, oh, it comes from these forces in endogenous growth we'll talk about in the next slide. And then you should go, and where do those come from? It's always one more question beyond, right? So that's where we're going to go. And the answer to where those endogenous forces for growth come from tends to split into two big literatures, the institutions literature and the culture literature. If you want to learn everything about them, come take 333 with me. So even in the Solow model, if there is no technical change, growth will fizzle out, right? We will increase capital, we will increase labor, but we will hit that diminishing returns portion of the production function and we will stagnate, okay? And maybe we get one-time technical change. We invent something, right? So for example, in the Middle Ages, people figured out that they could rotate crops in a different way. Okay? Instead of leaving the fields fallow for half the year, they could just plant different crops at different times of the year, say wheat in 1/3 of the year, legumes another third, leave the field fallow another third. And that was called the 3-field system. It superseded the 2-field system. It increased productivity by 16%. They figured it out once, there was a discrete jump, but then it kind of stopped there, right? That's not sustained growth. Now, that's a one-time thing. It happened many times in history, but you just have it happen once, and then you hit diminishing returns again. That's not the growth we observe these days. We observe continuous growth. It's almost like it feeds off itself, okay? And so in order to sustain that kind of technical change, we cannot get stuck with diminishing or constant returns to scale, which are the basic assumptions of these economic models. We will need something that gives us increasing returns to scale, that keeps us going, right? And so that is what the endogenous growth literature is about. What are these sources of increasing returns to scale? And we have three answers for which we have 3 Nobel Prizes, okay? The first one was given by Robert Lucas. Now, Robert Lucas was an economist of the University of Chicago that you will certainly encounter in a variety of courses. He could have gotten the Nobel Prize for any number of contributions. It was one of these sort of intellectual titans that had something to say about everything. And his 1998, I believe, econometrica paper was about the role of human capital. The idea was that our production functions have constant returns to scale in capital and labor, but if you look inside what labor is, in reality there are different qualities of labor, and you can upgrade the quality of labor by investing in human capital. This is what we are hopefully doing right now at this very moment. We are upgrading your human capital, right? And so by investing in human capital, by improving the quality of labor, we break that constant returns to scale straitjacket, and we start getting these increasing returns are growing. So education, training, making people smarter, it's one source of endogenous growth. The second strand in the literature was due to Paul Romer and to Eugene Grossman and Ilhanan Helpman. Okay. And what these authors did, Romer beat Grossman and Helpman by 1 year and got the Nobel Prize. Grossman and Helpman did not. They should have as well. How many people are in Econ 101 here or took it with me? Excellent. This is where monopolistic competition comes in, right? So they wrote down models of monopolistic competition where utility and growth comes from varieties of a particular good, right? We humans like variety. We prefer to have choice when you go to the grocery store, have 3 or 4 brands, have different little things. And so what firms do to get our business is they innovate in giving us different flavors, different shades, different features in each product, okay? And so innovation in the Romer model and in the Grossman and Helpman model takes the form of introducing new varieties and carving out a slice of an existing market, okay? And because innovators get tiny monopoly rents, monopolistically competitive rents, that's their incentive to enter. And by doing so, they expand the product scope and they increase social welfare because we like varieties, right? So endogenous growth comes from there, from monopolistic competition and from the increase in varieties. The Aghion and Howitt contribution that was mentioned by the Nobel Committee, instead of generating growth by this horizontal expansion of varieties, posited a vertical framework in which there is only one variety for each product line. So imagine one type of car, one type of apple, one type of furniture. And the incumbent has monopoly rents. They have a patent over the good that is being sold, right? But there's free entry. And so other people see, hey, that person has monopoly rents, I want a piece of that. They innovate, they come in with a better version of the product, and they steal the market from the incumbent, right? They patent it and they get the monopoly rents themselves. And that's growth. Growth is how much better the new product is over the old one, right? And the reason we know that is because we're buying it. We're free to keep buying the old one, right? So that is sort of the basic framework. Now, all of these frameworks harken back to the seminal work of one economist, Joseph Schumpeter. Okay? Lived between 1883 and 1950, was a Harvard professor most of his life. Did not get a Nobel Prize only because he died too early. Remember, the Nobel Prize in economics is 1968, right? And as I've told my first-year students, he was famous for stating that he had 3 goals in life. Who remembers those? The best lover in Vienna, to be the best lover in Vienna, the best horseman in Austria, and the best economist in the world. And famously said he had achieved 2 of them, and never specified which ones. So Schumpeter introduced the idea of creative destruction, the idea that growth did not come in a sort of a parsimonious improvement, it came in a fiercely bloody competition for the market, where what you wanted to do is be a monopolist, beat the others out, improve upon them, and make sure your competitors went out of business. This is really what you want to do, because if they go out of business, you get their business, you get to be rich, and now who cares about the rest? So it's this sort of cutthroat type of competition. And so you create to destroy. You bring something new to eliminate other industries. And so in destroying the other industries, you free up those factors of production that they were using, which are going to then be inputs in new innovations, maybe in your same industry, maybe in another one, right? So Schumpeter comes to sort of completely turn on its head the idea of perfect competition that we have inherited from Adam Smith and from Marshall, where there are no profits, everyone does the same thing, everyone sells the same homogeneous product, and it's like a bleak existence where you barely get through, make do, and nothing else. He goes like, that's not how the business world works. The business world works by outcompeting the other people in the market. So creative destruction underpins the Aghion-Howitt model, right? Because we have these product lines, and there is one incumbent, you, that have your little monopoly, are selling, I don't know, your toy trains, but there's always someone behind trying to invent a better toy train and drive you out of business, right? And when they succeed, they get a patent, they sell their toy trains at a cheaper price than you do, or they make their toy trains better, and people want to buy them, and you're out of business. Right? So the idea here is we are not expanding varieties, we are taking a product line and make it better, 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 and better, but it is still a monopolistic competition model, right? So this is why I bother you guys with monopolistic competition. In order to understand modern economics and economic growth, monopolistic competition is really at the heart of it all. It's one of the most important models out there, and I think it's really sort of not taught well enough in undergraduate. So when you get to your other courses, just get on in the case of your professors and ask the question, what about monopolistic competition in this context? You're going to look smart too. So, all right, so these patent protections provide the incentive to innovate, right? Because you're going to have this monopoly. And so the idea is, okay, the incentive to innovate is patent protection and rents, right? And so the rate of technical change can be calculated as deriving from the policies that exist, whether a country has a good enough institutional system, whether your invention will be patent protected or not, or whether someone can steal it from you, okay? And on how easy it is to come up with these new innovations. So the final formula is that the growth rate is equal to the arrival rate of new innovations, which they model as a Poisson process that will come at some point when you study statistics. But basically, every now and then, there is a new idea that strikes people and go like, oh, I want to do this. But also the magnitude of the quality jumps, whether these ideas represent big jumps or small jumps. This paper was a big hit, and it spurred a large literature to which Aghion and Howitt contributed time and time again. And so I'm going to just highlight a couple more contributions by them. One is that, actually one big one, is that competition, too much competition is not always good. Okay? So they basically established that there is a sort of U-shaped relationship between the amount of competition in an economy and economic growth. If there is too little competition, and you're an incumbent in one of these product markets, you have no incentive to innovate. You're sitting pretty. No one's coming to steal your market. No one will get new ideas. No one will enter. Okay. So no competition is bad. But if there is too much competition, if there's too many people having ideas out there, you don't want to innovate because you have to spend a lot of money on bringing your idea to market, and very quickly someone else will have a better idea and kick you out, right? So if there is too much competition, or if there is too little patent protection, then the rate of economic growth also slows down. That's also something that you've heard me say time and time again, is there's no first best equilibrium in these markets. It's all a bit second best in the sense that you need some level of patent protection, you need some level of monopolistic markets in order to incentivize innovation. If you have none of that, innovation doesn't happen and you stagnate. Okay? So achieving sustained growth is a balancing act between rents and entry. How easy it is to come into a market versus what profits can an incumbent expect. And this is most definitely not agreeing with what people call classical economics, where rents are bad and entry is always good, right? These sort of modern models are telling us there is a space for rents. There is a function that they play. Okay, that's John Howitt. Now on to economic history. This is Joël Mokyr. Okay. Joël Mokyr was born in 1946 in the Netherlands, Leiden, but at age 9, he was taken to Israel by his mother and grew up there. And studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, did his military service there, met his wife, who was his army superior and continues to be so. And in the 1970s, he moved to the US, got his PhD at Yale under Bill Parker, and took his first and only job as a professor of history and economics at Northwestern University. And that's the first thing that's rare. Okay? Economics and history are two disciplines that, at least in academia, do not talk to each other a lot. And over the past few years, they have really diverged in terms of the ideological and intellectual underpinnings that they have. And yet, Mokyr is a full professor in 2 departments, full citizen, has 2 offices, shows up at every seminar, advises students in both departments. This is already rare, and it gives you an idea of the breadth of intellectual scope that Mokyr has. He has written 14 scholarly books. There's one more in press that will come out next year or so. The last one just came out this month. Right? He is the editor of one encyclopedia, the 5-volume Oxford Encyclopedia of Economic History, where I have my first 2 published pieces. One article on the economic history of organized crime, and the other one on the history of technological change in the radio and television industry, because I'm clearly an expert. It's like, what happened is he had commissioned all the articles for the encyclopedia, and he was short about 30 articles. He basically sent this email to the graduate students. I'm paying $700 an article, who wants them? And so the graduate student, you go like, I work for food. It's like, that was the lowest hourly rate I have been ever paid in my life. But it gave me my first 2 lines in the internet. He has published over 100 journal articles, peer-reviewed, okay, more than 120 book reviews, and I haven't verified this. He's for sure the economic historian that has trained most doctoral students ever. It's probably one of the economists that has trained the most doctoral students ever, over 70. These numbers are not unusual in the hard sciences because you have a lab with 14 or 20 students at a time. In economics, we train our PhD students one at a time. And so having 70 students is quite impressive. It's even more impressive that the vast majority of them are academics. They are professors, okay? And they tend to get amazing jobs. I am living proof of that. So, So I will sort of review Mokyr's contribution by just following his major books, like, and telling you what's in them. These two are not related to the Nobel Prize, but are his very early books, the ones that got him tenure. The first one is called Industrialization in the Low Countries, and it's actually his PhD thesis, just in book form. And it is what was a very classic type of study by them, trying to establish when did the Netherlands and Belgium industrialize, what shape it took. They had two very different trajectories, even though they are geographically and culturally very similar. So the difference, as people that took 333 can intuit right now, it's in the institutions. So there was a lot of reconstructing national accounts, figuring out how fast growth was, and so on. The second one did make a splash. It's a book called Why Ireland Starved. It's a study of the Great Irish Famine, more colloquially known as the Irish Potato Famine. The story there, it's one of sort of the most brutal famines of the 19th century, especially because it came in Western Europe. And Ireland was at that point a part of Great Britain, the whole thing, not just the north. But it was a fairly poor place. And population had grown very fast in the early part of the 19th century. And in 1845, the main crop, the potato, failed because of the potato blight, which is a fungus that causes potatoes to rot. Okay? And the potato was by then a monoculture. It was almost the only thing Ireland grew. And it relied enormously on it, and a lot of people basically starved to death. And the prevailing explanations were, well, it's classic malfunction. It's like these people reproduced beyond the ability of their economy to sustain them, and at some point something bad happens, everybody dies, we start again. There was a second line of argument that was, it's the fault of the British. They sort of wanted to get rid of the Irish, and when they saw that the potato had failed, they closed the borders, they prevented relief, and they left the Irish to die. And this part of the scholarship was very much looking not at what happened in Ireland, but at what happened in Ukraine under Stalin. Well, the dynamics had been exactly of Russia causing the famine and closing the borders and making the Ukrainians starve. So Mokyr comes into this very politically charged fray and actually does the numbers, collects productivity measures, figures out what the soil conditions were, has county-level data about population, incomes, potato productivity, and figures out that Ireland was producing, or could have produced, twice as much food as needed to feed the entire population. But the reason for that was that it had switched from other crops to the potato. Because the potato is an incredibly efficient crop. It produces 3 times as many calories per acre as wheat. Takes 3 times as much work too, but Ireland was a work-abundant, land-scarce place. And so this was really good. And the potato is one of those miracle foods that contains every single nutrient you need to survive, except vitamin A and D. You can get those from milk. And so if you eat potatoes and milk, you will live a long and boring life, but long and healthy. Okay. So it was not that Ireland had grown beyond its means. Could still grow a lot more potatoes. It was that it had made a Faustian bargain. In order to support its population, it had shut off every other crop except the potato. So it put itself in a position of fragility. When the potato failed, it had no fallback option. Okay? It traded off abundance for insurance, for diversification. What about the British? The British could have helped. If they had sent relief, which they were able to, lives would have been saved. But what Mokyr says is this was a sin of omission. They didn't do it because they thought the market would fix it. Because such was the thinking in the British government at the time, headed by William Pitt. And when they decided to spring into action a year later, they figured out things were really bad. It was too late. So, if anything, the ideological drive was one of trusting in economics too much, or in their own kinds of economics, not really wanting to kill the Irish. So those are the early contributions. They are not mentioned at all in the Nobel Prize. Why do I talk about them? Because if Mokyr had not written a single page about industrialization and economic growth, he would still be today the foremost living scholar on the Irish family. Okay? So again, that's the breadth of intellectual scholarship. Okay, so let's get to the contributions that end up in the Nobel Prize. I'm going to talk about 5 different books here. This is the second chronologically, but the first sort of conceptually. This is an edited book, right? So it says edited by Joy Mokyr, which means it's a collection of essays written by other people. And you ask, well, how is that a contribution? How is that a book? He got other people to write it, right? He's not doing much here. But he wrote the introduction to the book. Because he is Mokyr, the introduction takes up more than half the book. And so it is a really important contribution in its own right. It's enormously cited. Okay? Now, this is not what we learned from him. We knew that the Industrial Revolution is the central transformation at the origin of economic growth. Humanity has 2 such transformations. The Neolithic Revolution, over 13,000 years ago, when we switched from being hunter-gatherers to farmers, invention of agriculture, and the Industrial Revolution, where we introduce industrial means of production with a very large increase in productivity. And so what this book does is really brings the scholarship of the Industrial Revolution into modern economic frameworks, right? And it settles some long-standing old debates, okay? One is, well, was it really a revolution? Did things change so dramatically? And part of that questioning comes from the fact that when you look at rates of growth, now they are like very, very small before the Industrial Revolution. At the end of the 20th century, they're very fast, but there's no break, there's no jump. It's just a small increase in the rate of growth, and then just a little bit faster, and just a little bit faster. And it looks like it takes forever to get to modern rates of economic growth. And people were asking, well, how is it possible that such a thing is called a revolution? It takes over 150 years to get to the new growth steady state. You know, that sounds like gradual change to me. And Mokyr shut down that line of argument by saying, look, you know, you have 2 sectors. One is very large, call it farming. There's no technical change in it. And one is very small, call it manufacturing. You start having very fast rates of growth in manufacturing. But because the sector is very small, it has very limited impact on the economy as a whole. You see these slow rates of growth. So technology is growing very fast. That's why it's a revolution. Overall GDP per capita starts growing very slow because manufacturing is very small. But since it's growing so fast, manufacturing takes a larger and larger chunk of the economy, and eventually the rate of economic growth converges to that of manufacturing. Mokyr is a very funny guy, very witty, right? He has all these quips. So one of the arguments that were made by historians is, how can we say there was an industrial revolution if people did not talk about a revolution at the time? Mokyr has a brilliant line in that book, says, well, you know, the Greeks and the Romans never wrote about living during classical antiquity either. You don't know what you're going through. You can only see it in hindsight.
Right.
Another point is, well, was it circumscribed to Britain? Mokyr has a great line in there. There was an industrial revolution. It was British, right? Britain was different than the rest of the other countries, and he shows it in many, many ways, right? With aggregates, with manufacturing, with the types of products, exports, and so on. And so part of what we're going to talk in the other 4 slides is, why Britain? You know, why not somewhere else? Were there any prerequisites for industrialization? There have been a literature before that said, well, in order to industrialize, you need an agricultural revolution, you need a transportation revolution, you need to open your markets, you know, like a checklist of things. And then if you ticked all the boxes, you would industrialize. And if that was true, everyone would be industrialized by now because we would have like a blueprint for doing it, and that's not the case. And we will see what Mokyr thinks of that. Okay, and then also, what was the role of human capital? People need to be educated in order for an industrial revolution to happen. And the startling conclusion is, for the first industrial revolution, the one that brought the cotton textile factories, the steam engine, and so on, no, you did not need an educated workforce. Okay? Most of these tasks required very low levels of skills. You needed a few inventors that could figure out how to create new machines. And after that, the workforce would be pretty unskilled. That changed towards the end of the 19th century with the second industrial revolution, which came with electrification and with the petrochemical industry. There, yes, you need to know that if you connect the wrong two cables, everything goes boom, right? And if you mix two bad compounds, you can poison yourself, so education becomes more important. The first book in that sort of strike, the Industrial Revolution, one was the second, is this one, right? The Level of Riches. The Level of Riches is a fascinating book because of, in some sense, how little formal economics there is into it. Most of the book is a painstaking description of the innovations that happened during the Industrial Revolution. There's a chapter dedicated to the steam engine where he will tell you exactly what every little part of a steam engine does and how it works. I said, I thought this was an economic history book and I'm learning about engineering. And yes, you are, because one of Mokyr's central teachings is if you want to understand what's going on, you really need to understand what's going on. There were machines that transform productivity. You will not understand why that happened unless you understand how the machine works and how it was possible for people to create the machine in the first place. And so you have about 10 chapters with like dissections of every single machine and then explaining why it was possible to make that machine and how that particular design resulted in an increase in productivity. And then comes sort of the magic. He starts aggregating and distilling the lessons of that. And he classifies all these inventions that happened during the Industrial Revolution in two big categories. Some of them are called macro inventions. And these are sort of like big ideas, paradigm shifting, completely sector appending things. It's like, for example, the steam engine is the classical macro invention. The steam engine is the first machine in human history that can convert thermal energy, heat, into mechanical energy, movement. Before that, if you wanted thermal energy, you started with thermal energy. You burned something to get heat. If you wanted mechanical energy, you needed a source of mechanical energy, something that moved, a horse or a river spinning a waterway or people. You could not take heat and make things move. That is what the steam engine does. That's why it is a macro invention. It changes the way we think about applying energy to production. But the steam engine was a very cumbersome and inefficient machine. Only about 1% of the thermal energy in early steam engines was converted into mechanical energy, which meant you could not run a steam engine for economic profit because it was just too expensive to run. And so the steam engine had been around actually for quite a while in some sort of shape. But the invention of the steam engine is credited to James Watt in 1754, I think. And James Watt did not invent the steam engine. He invented something else. He invented a small component called the separate condenser, which had the effect of enormously increasing the efficiency of steam engines by separating the hot and the cold parts of the engine. The early engines were getting hot and getting cold, getting hot and getting cold, getting hot and getting cold, and that dissipated a lot of energy. By keeping one part always hot and one part always cold, what increased the efficiency of the steam engine and made it economically profitable. And that's where we see factories appear. We see entrepreneurs buying engines to power machines. The separate condenser is what Mokyr calls a micro invention, a small twist on something that exists but unlocks enormous potential. Another one is, for example, the iron paddling and rolling process, right? Which is a very simple thing. When you're smelting iron in a furnace, the problem with iron is managing the level of impurities it has. If it has too few impurities, then it's going to be brittle. If it has too many impurities, you're not going to be able to mold it into the shape you want, and so you have to be in a very specific range. Right? And this is a process that is basically stirring iron in certain parts of the furnace and burning off the impurities until you meet some parameters, and then you can produce what's called wrought iron at scale, the iron that comes out in bars, and then you can sort of work with to produce other goods. Again, it's something small. Iron making has been around forever. Okay? This is just one process that could be performed by anyone with 1 day of training, but it leads to this sort of new sector. This continues to be true. Okay? So today we can distinguish between macro and micro inventions. For example, organ transplantation, that's a macro invention. The idea that you can take a kidney from one person and put it into another person and save their life. And the first person still alive, right? And both work with one kidney, but lose a mind, right? That's a macro invention. But the big problem with organ transplantation is compatibility between donor and recipient, right? The rejection of the organ. And so for transplantation to work, you need a lot of other things. You need anti-rejection drugs, a micro invention that allows the macro invention to work. Or one win for economists, organ donor chains. The idea that if you can have a person that altruistically donates an organ, you can kickstart a chain of organ donation where you match compatible donors and recipients that do not know each other. And so instead of having to find specific matches, you can have up to 60 or 80 people in a big long circle, each one donating an organ to the next. Right. So again, a micro invention, it's not even, it's an algorithm really that was created by an economist named Alvin Roth that unlocks the potential of the macro invention. So that's the big idea in level of riches. And so Mokyr closes the book by saying, so here's one key to why Britain had an industrial revolution. In Britain, there weren't many big ideas, but it was a place that had a comparative advantage in micro inventions. They were the thinkers, the adapters, the people that made it work. So then, next book is called The Gifts of Athena. Athena is the Greek goddess of wisdom and knowledge, right? And this is an exploration into what is knowledge and how it becomes economically useful. Mokyr begins by defining two types of knowledge. One is called propositional knowledge, and it's the knowledge that's focused on asking why things work. And then we have prescriptive knowledge. You can think of prescriptive knowledge as the recipes, okay, the how things work. So when I'm using a projector, a computer and a projector, and a clicker to make the slides, I'm using prescriptive knowledge, right? I know that if I press this button here, things move. I don't have the faintest idea of why it works, right? This is magic. There's some radio waves and things going on, but I don't know, right? I'm working with prescriptive knowledge, not with propositional knowledge. If I want to understand that, I need to bring like a software engineer or an electrical engineer that can explain things to me or fix them if they go wrong. Now, for most of humanity, prescriptive knowledge vastly outpaced propositional knowledge. People figured out how things could work, but they didn't know why they work. It's kind of they stumbled upon the solutions, right? So you can see, for example, people try to find solutions to chemical problems, for example. Know how to prevent metals from corroding. But without chemistry, you can't really sort of get to a result quickly. You're basically doomed to trial and error, to try different things. And this was sort of the basis of what we know as alchemy, which we think people are trying to turn lead into gold. Well, yes, they were trying to turn lead into gold, but they were trying to solve a lot of more mundane things, and they were just not getting there because they were operating without the benefit of propositional knowledge. Right? They were living in what Mokyr calls a narrow epistemic context. There's just not much understanding of what's going on. there's also a social distinction that works against that bridging that type of gap, which is that the people that specialize in propositional knowledge, the sages, the savants, they call them, thought too highly of themselves and did not concern themselves with the ways of the world, with making things work. Okay? They thought of themselves being above the station of the people that work with their hands, called the fabricants. The fabricants are the ones that have experience, that know what works and what does not, and why certain things may not work. So really you need both of them to crack hard problems. What changed was the Industrial Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution in the 17th and 18th centuries. Scientific revolution is associated with Galileo, the introduction of the scientific method, the idea that you can have falsifiable hypotheses that you can test with experiments. Okay? And that way you can derive how things work in nature. The Industrial Enlightenment is the name given to the work of several Scottish and English philosophers, okay? Among them most prominently Francis Bacon, but also people like Adam Smith, who were concerned about bringing the principles of the scientific revolution to practical matters. And the result of that was bringing together propositional and prescriptive knowledge in the context of scientific research, and starting a vicious cycle where a problem arose from practice. We do not know how to bleach fabric to make it white. Okay, so here's what we know about chemistry and compounds and chlorine and whatnot. Let's do some scientific research. Let's try different scientific compounds. Okay? Try this. Try to produce at scale. What's the problem now? Well, this thing emanates toxic gases and everyone dies when we do it. Okay, let's try a different compound that does not generate toxic gases. So there's this feedback loop between the savants and the fabricants, the people that do the theoretical research and the people that apply it, right? And also a bridging of that social gap. And that is what underpins the rapid increase in knowledge and technological change. The last two books are about Europe and Britain. First, Britain. In the enlightened economy, the idea that the question that Mokyr asks is, okay, why Britain? Why in this godforsaken rock in the middle of the ocean, okay, that was dirt poor? Why in some sort of remote areas of Britain? No, industrialization doesn't happen in London, in the big metropolis. It's like out there in Manchester, Lancaster, weird places. And that is where he really goes into the nature of the Scottish Enlightenment. Right? These ideas that nature can be known, can be understood, can be quantified. And the first works are really things like encyclopedias, just a classification of everything that there is to know in nature, okay? With the idea of, well, let's see if we can discern patterns of how things work, if you can understand them better. And then applying the scientific principles to the research on nature. And so one of the ways in which this happens is with the establishment of learned societies. Now we think of learned societies as, for example, the Royal Society or something like that, where the brilliant minds get together. But what was happening was that in every little town and hamlet, there was an amateur learned society where people got together to discuss scientific breakthroughs or tinkering or sometimes even hobbies. It's like, look, I made this little machine work. Oh, let me see. That's cool. What if we change that other little thing? Let's share it in this sort of journal that circulates to all our little amateur societies. Now someone else across the country knows about what we've done, and maybe they have another idea. There's a lot of sharing of open source, we would call it today, advances, a lot of which is done now for pure amateur interest and fun, but there's certainly people that want to make money out of these things. For example, one of the biggest inventions of the Industrial Revolution is the spinning jenny. It's a machine that automates the spinning of yarn. And it's invented by James Hargreaves in his literally garage, except that there are no cars, right? It's an addendum to his house. He keeps it a secret because he doesn't want others to copy it. He doesn't patent it. And he just starts flooding the market with cheap yarn. It doesn't end up well for him because the people that were selling expensive yarn do not like being undercut. They figure out where it's coming from. They burn his house down, and then he has to start over. But there's a lot of this tinkering, trying new things, exchanging ideas. And the idea of the Lab Society is that they are going precisely to bridge this gap between savants and fabricants. They are going to connect high science with lowly craft and feed back the insights to science. Most importantly for Britain, though, there's two things that matter here, maybe three. One is an environment of secure property rights. Britain has a patent system, one of the first in the world. So there is a guarantee, at least in the books, that if you invent something, you're going to make money off it. The second one is an open environment for new ideas. Britain was, from the 1600s on, a place that tolerated weirdness, right? And when you think about inventors, tinkerers, university professors, it's like they're all weirdos. They're all people that are just a bit odd to be around in society. They have their quirks, they have their mannerisms, they are introverts, they speak in indecipherable ways, and in many places those people are not well tolerated. Right? They are ostracized, they may be incarcerated. Britain was a place where they would let you be as long as you kept appearances up. Now, you may have in your mind the idea of the Victorian society, all stuck up and stifled. You have to be proper and pure. Yes, on the surface, right? You have to appear to be that. As long as you do not make a public scandal, in Victorian society, everything went. You may think about the case of Oscar Wilde, who was imprisoned for, not for being a homosexual, actually, but for corrupting a minor. Yes, it only happened after the whole thing was in the newspaper. So, right, he had lived that life for 40 years with everyone knowing and nobody bothered him. So that is the kind of society that Britain had. And so that's a place where inventors thrive. And there weren't many places where that would happen at the time. Okay. Now, as Mokyr already hinted at in the Liver of Riches, many of the ideas came from abroad. Okay? But they found a place to thrive in Britain. They found a place where they could be tested without too much judgment, where if they succeeded, then people could become rich because of them. So the final book I want to discuss is called The Culture of Growth, and here Mokyr takes the broad view and looks at the entire continent of Europe. So as the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe, it didn't happen in China. It didn't happen in the Middle East. It didn't happen in the Americas. Why? Okay. Especially, why not China? China had a very advanced society. In fact, it had been very close to cracking the necessary techniques for starting the large-scale production of iron in the year 1200 during the Song dynasty. Right? And it quite possibly did not progress because of the Mongol invasion that really wiped out Chinese society and culture at the time and replaced it with the Manchu standards. So he starts looking at the Middle Ages and says, well, Europe has a couple of things going for it. First, it has this unique institution, the university, which is a place dedicated to the preservation, recording, and transmission of knowledge. There are some other similar things, like the madrasas in the Islamic world, but these are mostly places of religious scholarships. European universities start out as places of religious scholarship, but very quickly move into the study of law and the study of medicine. And once you start studying medicine in earnest, there's no going back because you have to cut dead bodies open. Okay? And you start learning a lot of things about the way the human body works, and you start asking more questions, and that leads you into asking questions about nature and how animals differ from humans, from plants, and from there it goes everywhere. And then it moves also into literature and philosophy, and all of a sudden it's not just religious literature and religious philosophy, but also on the lay side, the university becomes universal. The second institution that's unique to Europe is what's known as the Republic of Letters. And the Republic of Letters was not anything in particular, it was just the practice between European philosophers and scientists of writing to each other all the time. These people, I swear, spent more than half their life writing letters to each other. So Erasmus was writing to Luther, Galileo was writing to Drelichman. They just wrote and wrote and wrote and shared what they were working on. Okay? And this is just what you did. If you're a scientist, you want others to know what you're doing. It's also a way of establishing precedence of discovery. If I tell you what I discovered, then you cannot say that you discovered it first. Right? And so this Republic of Letters happens in almost every area of knowledge for about 200, 300 years. They are just trying to sort of, in a friendly or not so friendly way, sort of get ahead of each other. And sometimes things blow up, right? Newton and Leibniz both claim to have discovered calculus first, and that's an argument that continues today. The idea then, now there's more stuff that comes on. The printing press comes in the second half of the 15th century and enormously lowers the cost of recording knowledge and spreading knowledge. Now we can make a lot of copies and just let everyone know what's going on. And the final element is the political fragmentation. Europe is fragmented into several states. And so if your research is inconvenient to the sovereign of the time, suppose that you are Michelangelo and the Pope doesn't like the way you painted the Sistine Chapel, then you run away to Florence and the Pope cannot get you there, right? If you're Leonardo, you can sort of sell your services first to the Duke of Milan, then go to Venice, and then move to France. So if you become persona non grata in some place, there's someone else who's going to be willing to hire you for your wisdom or your abilities or your services. Europe was sitting in the middle of two extremes. China was at one extreme, a monolithic, unified, giant state. There's no escaping from the imperial bureaucracy. You cannot dissent. If you're doing something the emperor doesn't like, it's going to be bad for you. That is one of the reasons why Chinese technological progress is very slow and sometimes goes backwards. The famous case are those of the ocean-going ships of Admiral Zheng He. Admiral Zheng He is a very famous naval warrior. He had, and he didn't invent them, these ships have been evolving for years. He had ocean-going ships that sailed from China all over the Indian Ocean to the coast of Africa to trade. They were much larger than the European ships at the time. They had large capacity. They were liable to make Chinese traders very rich. So these are going to be the Ming emperors get scared. And rightly so, because it's that type of commercial enrichment that in Britain leads to the demise of absolute monarchy and constitutional reform. Chinese emperors will have none of that, and they essentially forbid the construction of new ocean-going ships. And within 100 years, the technology is lost. And Chinese sailors no longer can cross the ocean. They lost technology, they went backwards because of a unified type of government. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the Islamic Caliphate, which would probably have been able to evolve in a European-like fashion, but is destroyed by the Mongol horde. In 1200, they take Baghdad. Baghdad was a city of 1 million people at the time, only the second one in history to have reached that size after Rome. Right? And they basically burned the whole thing to the ground. The former caliphate lands fragment into a lot of different states. Eventually, some of them come under the Ottoman Turks, but in a way that remains with different sort of provincial administrations. Others go their separate ways. All the communication networks between scholars sort of break down. there's no more exchange. No? So Europe was this sort of Goldilocks zone, not too fragmented, not too unified, close geographically. You could still have this sort of exchanges that led to the development of new ideas and their implementation. So that is sort of Mokyr's big trajectory and how he has come to think and to make us think about almost all aspects of modern economic growth, from its intellectual origins to its sort of really mechanical nuts and bolts, to the political environment and the cultural environment that allows for its implementation. So even though I said that the Nobel Committee recognizes a contribution, not a trajectory, there's no separating contribution from trajectory here. And this is sort of the vision that Mokyr has given us. But it's not just about history. We think the most important message is about what we should learn about it for present times. Because modern economic growth essentially depends, in Mokyr's view, on these three things: on open intellectual inquiry, on the free exchange of ideas, and on the strict application and the defense of scientific principles. And these are three things that are under attack today. There's no denying that science does not enjoy the same standing as it did, say, in the middle of the 20th century. That there's serious questionings about its value. There's serious questionings about the value of universities, which are the places where science is created and transmitted. And that there's even serious questions about the value of the free exchange of ideas. And what we are endangering in sort of questioning those things is nothing else but perhaps the one miracle that economics has given us, economic growth. So it's a bit bleak of a conclusion, but I think it's a very timely Nobel Prize because it reminds us of what's important and what's worth defending. And so I'll close with a few pictures. That's Mokyr, and only 1 or 2 years younger than I'm now in those pictures. So the closest one is this one here, about 5 years ago, at the top of the Squamish gondola. Just a personal note here. I have not been his student. It's that I am his student. Like literally 3 days before the Nobel Prize announcement, I got an email from him, and it was, "Hey Mauricio, I haven't heard from you in a while. So, how are your papers? Are you writing anything new? Are you submitting? Come on, get off your ass, Mauricio. It's like you need to publish." So, it's been 22 years, John. It's like, oh, he keeps doing that, and so it's actually been one of the great joys of this year to see him recognized, and look forward to celebrating with him in December. So I will leave it here, and I'll take your questions.